Picture this. You're a young boy, no older than 12, growing up in a dusty Anatolian town in the mid-1500s. The morning sun spills across the rooftops as you chase chickens in the courtyard, your laughter echoing through narrow alleys. Your grandmother kneads bread in the corner, and the smell of wood smoke lingers in the air, comforting and familiar. It feels like the world could never change. Then, shadows fall across your street. The clatter of boots, the rustle of silk robes, the sharp voices speaking in a language of command. Men from the Sultan's court have arrived. They are dressed in fine garments, carrying scrolls and sealed orders, their eyes scanning faces as if picking horses at a market. When one of them gestures toward you, time seems to stop. Your mother cries out, grabbing your arm, but her pleas dissolve into silence. Your father, frozen, knows that resistance would mean punishment not just for him, but for everyone he loves. You are dragged away, told it is an honor, that you will serve in the great palace, that your life will be grander than you could ever imagine. Yet as the caravan pulls you further from home, the only thing you hear is the sound of your mother's voice fading into the distance, a sound you will never hear again. This is how it began. This was the doorway into a world where boys were remade into servants of the empire. A world where innocence was stripped away, and survival became the only skill worth learning. And inside those palace walls, the horrors waiting for you would eclipse anything you could have feared on that final morning at home. Before we step deeper into these hidden chapters of history, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe if you want to uncover more stories the textbooks never dared to tell. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It's remarkable that across centuries and continents, we can still connect over the darkest pages of our shared past. Your arrival at the Imperial Palace was not the beginning of opportunity, it was the start of a carefully constructed nightmare. You and dozens of other boys were forced onto the road, driven for endless days through mountains and valleys. Food was scarce, water rationed, and nights were spent on cold earth or beneath ragged cloth that barely shielded you from rain and wind. The march itself was the first cruelty. You quickly discovered that weakness was not tolerated. Any child who stumbled too often, who coughed too long, or whose spirit broke was simply abandoned, left for the vultures and the silence of the wilderness. Survival was the first test, and most would fail it before ever seeing the palace gates. Beside you walked a boy no older than 14, taken from a tiny village on the Aegean coast. He whispered that his name had been Andreas, though even as he spoke it, he knew such names would soon be erased. One night he tried to slip into the dark and find his way home, but he didn't make it far. The guards caught him, dragged him back by his hair, and beat him until he could barely stand. His cries lingered long after, carved into your memory, a brutal warning that escape was an illusion. By the time the caravan reached the edges of Constantinople, now called Istanbul, you could already learn to disappear into silence. Speak only when ordered. Keep your eyes down. Never draw attention when the soldiers' gazes grew hungry or cruel. You counted the empty spaces in your line each morning, each missing face a reminder of the price of defiance or despair. And when the city finally came into view, the sight should have filled you with awe. The slender towers stabbing the sky, the colossal dome of Hagia Sophia gleaming in the sun, the endless walls of the Sultan's domain. But to you, it wasn't majesty. It was a cage. The glittering skyline was nothing more than the mask of the prison you had just entered. But instead of awe, a crushing emptiness pressed down inside you, heavier than stone. The sight of this glittering city did not inspire hope. It whispered of everything taken from you, and everything you dreaded you would soon become. The moment you arrived, the next ordeal began, the inspection. The survivors were herded into a courtyard where Ottoman officials began their evaluations with cold precision. You were prodded, measured, and scrutinized like livestock. They pulled open your mouth to count your teeth, struck your arms and legs to test your reflexes, asked you to recite the little knowledge you carried of words or numbers. They measured your height, examined your skin, and even judged the symmetry of your face as if selecting artwork, not children. The brightest and most physically perfect were marked for the Enderroom, the inner palace school. Others were assigned to the Janissary Corps, destined for the battlefield. But for those chosen for palace service, the trial was not of swords or cannons. It was of submission, silence, and survival under the weight of ritualized humiliation. You were among those selected for the Enderun. The judges glanced at your youthful face, your clear complexion, the spark of intelligence in your eyes, and they nodded with satisfaction. Only later would you realize that their nods and smiles were not blessings but ownership, the acknowledgement of predators who had identified their prize. The Enderun School is often described in glowing terms, celebrated as one of the earliest academies for cultivating talent. That label hides the darker truth. Yes, you were taught languages, Turkish, Arabic, Persian. You studied astronomy, mathematics, and poetry. You were drilled in music, calligraphy, and the finer arts of the empire. But every lesson came wrapped in fear, every skill sharpened at the expense of freedom. Within Topkapi's walls, your world shrank to a labyrinth of marble floors and gilded chambers. Behind every carved door and along every shadowed corridor lay another unspoken threat. You slept in crowded dormitories, ringed by guards and endless rules. Beyond those walls, the city bustled with life. Inside, you lived in a prison disguised as a palace. Escape wasn't just forbidden, it was unimaginable. The dormitory stretched out before you like a crypt dressed in marble, row after row of narrow cots draped in silk sheets that felt less like luxury and more like shackles. On your very first night inside those walls, you lay awake, ears straining against the unfamiliar darkness. You heard the muffled cries of boys stifling their grief in pillows, the low murmur of foreign tongues whispering in the shadows, the deliberate footsteps of older pupils and overseers circling long after the lamps had been extinguished. In your fist you clutched a small charm, an old wooden keepsake your mother had pressed into your palm when you were torn away. But by dawn, even that final link to your past would be stripped from you. The guards discovered it, took it, and replaced it with a new identity. They renamed you Mehmed, warning that your old faith and family ties no longer existed. Conversion to the Sultan's creed was not presented as a choice. It was staged as a ritual, complete with ceremony and pomp, to disguise the truth that it was forced upon you. You recited the words as commanded, lips moving in obedience, but in the quiet corners of your heart, you clung to the lullabies your mother once sang, and the tales your father whispered at night. Yet the harshest lesson you would learn was not about language, prayer, or study. It was about the slow, deliberate dismantling of your will. In this world, success was not earned solely through discipline or intelligence. It depended on your ability to submit, to entertain, to bend yourself into whatever shape pleased those above you. Advancement was currency, and your body could be demanded as part of the price. Your first taste of these unspoken rules came from an older boy named Yusuf, who had already spent years navigating the palace's cruel ladder. One evening he sat uninvited at the edge of your bed, his tone wrapped in both menace and false kindness. "You're new," he said quietly, placing a hand on your shoulder. "You don't yet know how things work here. But I do. I can protect you, help you rise. The masters trust me. They listen when I speak about the younger ones." And in that moment, with his hand heavy on your skin, you understood that lessons in this place were not just found in books or lectures. They were written on the body, taught through fear, and remembered in silence. You were barely 12, untouched by strangers, yet the way he leaned in made every nerve in your body tighten. His tone shifted lower, almost conspiratorial. "Protection comes with a price," he whispered. "There are ways you can show gratitude, ways that stay between us." It was the same impossible dilemma countless boys before you had faced. Say no and invite beatings, humiliation, and exile to the bottom of the social order. Say yes and hand over the last fragile pieces of your innocence to a system that saw you not as a child, but as currency. In the palace, survival often meant swallowing shame. This shadowed hierarchy had been built over generations. The eunuchs, men who had themselves been mutilated as boys, now controlled much of daily life. Instead of showing compassion, many turned their scars into weapons, using their authority to bend new arrivals into obedience. What had once been done to them, they now inflicted on others. Older students mimicked the same cruelty. It became a twisted tradition. To prove themselves, they preyed on those younger, passing trauma forward as if it were an unspoken law. And above them all, high-ranking officials indulged their desires without fear of consequence. The most attractive boys were selected, groomed and used, rewarded with privileges in exchange for silence. What made this especially insidious was that it wasn't a hidden scandal. It was embedded into the very structure of palace life. Exploitation was normalized, presented as part of advancement. A boy who pleased a powerful patron might be rewarded with better assignments, lighter duties, and opportunities to rise. Those who resisted were punished, reduced to drudgery, disciplined harshly, or erased from records altogether. For children like you, the psychological cost was deliberate and immense. Cut off from your past, stripped of your name, trapped in an environment where your body was treated as a bargaining chip. You learned to survive by numbing yourself, by shrinking into silence, by carrying wounds that no one would ever acknowledge. What we now call trauma was not an accident here. It was the design. Some boys adapted by turning cunning, realizing that their bodies could be leveraged as currency. They learned to charm, to flatter, to present themselves as willing participants in exchange for protection and privilege. Others retreated deep within, moving like shadows through the palace, physically present but emotionally hollow, their identities dissolving day by day. You witnessed both paths unfold. Yusuf, taken from a coastal village not far from yours, mastered the art of seduction quickly. Within half a year, he wore finer robes, ate richer meals, and studied under a private tutor. Outwardly, he had risen, but his laughter disappeared, his gaze dulled, and he never again spoke of his parents or the sea he once fished beside. When new boys entered the dormitory, he assessed them with the same predatory calculation the overseers had once used on him. In contrast, another boy, Andronikos, the son of a poor sailor, chose defiance. He rejected every advance, enduring brutal punishments and the cold isolation that followed. Over time, he seemed to dissolve into a husk of himself, completing his tasks mechanically, responding only when forced, until one morning, his bed was empty. His name was never spoken again, as though he had never existed. You tried to balance between these extremes, yielding enough to survive, while protecting a piece of yourself no one could touch. But in the palace, compromise was an illusion. Each day presented a fresh ordeal, another demand to bend, another scheme designed to strip away what remained of your autonomy. Occasionally, foreign eyes caught fragments of this hidden system. European envoys and merchants visiting the Ottoman court recorded impressions that revealed more than they intended. A Venetian diplomat in the mid-16th century remarked uneasily on the affection shown by senior officials toward their young attendants. He described boys scarcely older than 10, draped in silks and adorned with jewels, serving their masters with an intimacy that betrayed relationships far beyond the boundaries of propriety. A century later, a French envoy offered an unsettlingly candid account of what he saw inside the Ottoman court. At one reception, he described the young attendants gliding silently through gilded halls, their movements graceful yet mechanical, like exotic creatures on display. Their garments shimmered with jewels, but their lowered gazes betrayed no joy, only a quiet dread. He remarked on the way senior officials lingered over them possessively, and the fleeting look of terror that crossed a boy's face whenever his patron drew near. The physical structure of palace life was crafted to enforce this submission. Dormitories were crowded, airless, and devoid of privacy. Every word, every gesture was monitored by overseers. You were roused before sunrise to perform prayers drilled into you by rote, consumed plain meals at fixed intervals, and marched through an unyielding timetable that left no room for thought, only obedience. Discipline was harsh and often devised to strip away dignity. A fellow captive named Stefan dared to whisper in his native tongue one night. He was dragged into the courtyard and beaten in front of all. Another, called Luca, was caught tracing a cross on the wall of his bedframe. His punishment was to kneel in the dirt for hours while older students jeered, forced to embody the disgrace of remembering what he once was. The message could not be clearer. Your past was not only forbidden, it was something to be mocked and erased. An internal system of rewards deepened the manipulation. Small comforts, an extra portion of food, a softer blanket, access to rare books or instruments, were handed out like currency to those who excelled in lessons or who gratified their overseers in more personal ways. These privileges became lifelines, tokens of survival in an otherwise barren existence. The result was a network of rivalries, betrayals, and dependencies that ensured true rebellion remained unthinkable. To resist meant not only defying the masters, but also losing the fragile advantages you had clawed together within the prison of marble walls. You quickly learned that survival required strategy, not strength. You offered help with lessons to older boys, buying a fragile sort of safety from their unwanted attention. Excelling in language or mathematics won you notice from instructors who could shield you, if only a little, from the predatory culture around you. Smiling when told, bowing deeply, speaking the right words with apparent eagerness. These small performances of loyalty translated into small liberties that felt enormous in a life stripped of freedom.
Every so often, someone attempted to break the cycle and flee, but the palace sat on a spit of land ringed by walls and water, its bridges and gates heavily guarded. Escape was nearly impossible. You saw with your own eyes what happened to one boy who dared to swim into the dark waters of the Golden Horn. He was dragged back hours later, his body limp, his spirit shattered. The public thrashing he endured left him disfigured for life, a walking reminder of the futility of defiance. On the rare occasion someone did slip through the net, their fate outside was hardly better. Years of confinement had erased their old identities, making them strangers to their families and exiles in their own birthplaces. Villages sometimes shunned returnees as collaborators or faithless converts. Many had no trade, no means of survival beyond the palace's rigid hierarchy. A few lived as vagabonds, adrift in a society that no longer had a place for them. Most were caught and dragged back, their capture celebrated as proof that the system could not be escaped. For those of you who remained, growing older inside those marble walls brought no relief, only new layers of corruption. You learned to bend without breaking, to conceal anger behind a polite smile, to let pieces of yourself die so that some part of you might live. Yet with every compromise, you felt your soul being reshaped into something unrecognizable, molded not by choice, but by a relentless empire that demanded obedience above all. The brightest among you were eventually rewarded with titles and positions that carried prestige across the empire. Some became governors, judges, or high-ranking advisors within the Ottoman bureaucracy. But advancement demanded a heavy price: complicity. The men who had drilled obedience into you, who had used and discarded you as boys, revealed themselves for what they truly were: survivors of the same system, now passing on its cruelties to keep their own power intact. The cycle fed upon itself generation after generation. By the time you reached maturity, the palace had left you with a decision no child should ever face. To resist was to invite destruction, exile, or death. To comply was to inherit the role of overseer, recruiting fresh boys, subjecting them to the same humiliations you had endured, ensuring the machinery of exploitation never faltered. Many chose survival over morality, transforming from victims into perpetrators. The ritual of Chikma, the official release from palace schooling into state service, was celebrated with pomp and ceremony. Outwardly, it looked like triumph. You emerged fluent in several tongues, schooled in mathematics, philosophy, and courtly etiquette, trained to administer provinces or serve in diplomatic missions. But beneath the polished surface lay scars no ritual could conceal. You carried with you a worldview where dominance and submission were inseparable from authority, where intimacy was confused with exploitation, and where trust had been systematically destroyed. For many graduates, leaving the palace did not mean freedom. It meant carrying its lessons into the wider empire, lessons of manipulation, control, and survival at any cost. Even in positions of great influence, the shadow of the palace clung to you, shaping your every decision, haunting every attempt at a normal life. Those funneled into the ranks of the military carried invisible wounds alongside their weapons. Some became ruthless instruments of the Sultan's authority, channeling years of humiliation into cruelty against others. Others crumbled under the weight of their past, drifting through campaigns like hollow men, unable to reconcile duty with the scars of their youth. Within the Ottoman elite, the perception of this system was carefully curated. On paper, regulations outlawed mistreatment, presenting the palace schools as models of discipline and refinement. In practice, however, officials looked the other way when abuses reinforced obedience
or produced unwavering servants. The empire's needs outweighed the lives of the children it consumed. Efficiency, loyalty, and skill were celebrated as triumphs of education, while the suffering behind them was conveniently ignored. Even Ottoman scholars occasionally hinted at these darker truths, though their words were wrapped in justifications. One chronicler in the 1500s wrote, "The palace takes in raw youth and returns them as polished diamonds. Though the process is harsh and not all endure it, those who survive are unmatched in service and loyalty." Such accounts framed cruelty as a forge of greatness, disguising exploitation as necessary sacrifice.
But for those who lived it, the truth was far grimmer. What they called training was in reality coercion. What they named discipline was the systematic dismantling of your old identity and the forced construction of a new persona, designed not for your benefit but to serve the empire's appetite for control, pleasure, and power. Your so-called education came at a devastating price: the loss of your childhood, your innocence, and the ability to form natural human connections. What made the Ottoman palace system especially sinister was the way it blurred genuine intellectual training with institutionalized exploitation. On one hand, the schooling you received was far ahead of its time. Lessons in languages that granted access to the courts of Europe and the Middle East, exposure to mathematics and astronomy that rivaled the most advanced scholars, and instruction in statecraft, law, and military strategy that prepared you for positions of influence. But every achievement was chained to abuse. The same mentors who taught you to calculate the stars also treated your body as property. The same rulers who promised upward mobility ensured that progress came only through humiliation. The brilliance of the system was that it disguised trauma as opportunity, leaving its victims unable to separate their accomplishments from their degradation. This institution lays bare the uneasy marriage between power, sexuality, and violence in pre-modern societies. The Ottomans were not the only empire to exploit the vulnerable. Similar patterns of coercion could be found in courts from Persia to Renaissance Europe. Yet the Ottoman model stood out for its scale, its organization, and its unapologetic integration into the machinery of imperial rule. It was not whispered about in shame. It was openly defended as a mechanism of refinement and control. By the 1600s and 1700s, the palace system began to weaken. The decline of the janissaries, the rise of new bureaucratic structures, and growing European influence gradually eroded its dominance. But for the thousands of boys who had already endured its cruelty, these reforms came far too late. Their voices, silenced, their identities erased, their youth stolen, remain as haunting evidence of one of history's most organized forms of institutionalized child exploitation. Those who endured the ordeal emerged into a world where survival demanded impossible compromises. Their appearance could open doors, yet also mark them as prey. Their intellect praised, yet their humanity denied. Every step forward in the palace hierarchy came at the expense of something irreplaceable within them. A few climbed to dizzying heights of power: statesmen, commanders, governors whose names shaped the empire's fate. But behind their authority lingered wounds that never healed, and many repeated the same cruelties they had once endured. Countless others faded into silence, lost in the shadows of history. Their names survived only in sterile ledgers that recorded their intake, their training, and their assignment, with no hint of the anguish that defined their lives. They became ghosts in the machinery of empire, useful, forgotten, erased. The palace where all of this unfolded still towers today, polished into a tourist attraction. Visitors stroll through resplendent halls, marveling at mosaics, domes, and carved woodwork, never suspecting the cries that once filled these rooms. Guides speak proudly of the palace school's academic achievements, its role in creating a disciplined bureaucracy, its contribution to imperial greatness. But the darker truth, the humiliation, the broken boys, the price paid in innocence, remains buried beneath polished marble and curated displays. What the brochures never tell you is that these walls were both classroom and cage. They produced educated servants, yes, but at a cost no monument can convey. And when we recall these stories today, they are not trivial footnotes to a glorious empire. They are testimonies of stolen childhoods, of resilience twisted into survival, of an institution that dressed exploitation in the language of honor and advancement. They were not abstract statistics, but living children, taken from warm homes, stripped of names, languages, and faith, reshaped into tools for an empire that prized their obedience more than their humanity. The boy we followed through these marble corridors is not alone. He stands for countless others whose identities dissolved into silence, their pain unrecorded, their voices lost in the pages of official history. The shadows of these forgotten lives still cling to the palace stones. Tourists may see elegance and power, but beneath the polished marble lie invisible scars, the weight of sorrow, fear, and submission. The true horror was not only the abuse itself, but how thoroughly it was systematized, normalized, and erased. It became part of the rhythm of empire, woven so deeply into its success that the world forgot the human cost. You and those like you were never meant to be remembered as people, only as instruments. Yet in telling this story, we restore your humanity. We refuse to let your suffering be reduced to exotic detail or sanitized tradition. Your footsteps echo across centuries, demanding recognition, reminding us that every empire's grandeur rests upon hidden victims. To remember you is to confront uncomfortable truths, that power is often built on the backs of the powerless, that progress and cruelty can coexist, and that innocence has too often been the first sacrifice in the pursuit of dominance. Your story is not just history. It is a warning, a testament, and a plea that future generations learn to value compassion above conquest.